going to be saying hello to John and Pat and Maureen and Barbara and Shrimp, Tia and Doug, Ron, Pat, Nanette, Holly and AJ, Roy, Tony Lee, Daniel, and Bobby. Where I want to start with today is the following quote and continue with this, because in the book, she drops it and that's it. And it's a major, major, major thing. And it's too bad she just kind of dropped it. It's on page 15. Now, let me read this to you. However, Israeli archaeologists who have been excavating the region since 1967 have found no evidence to corroborate this story. What is the story? The story that has been given us since the exile about how it all happened. There is no sign of foreign invasions or mass destructions, and nothing to indicate a large-scale change of population. The scholarly consensus is that the story of the Exodus and a bunch of other stuff is simply not historical. It is, if you will, creative fiction. And I want to go off back on that and share some things with you to kind of share what that all means. In 722 BCE, we mentioned this before, the Assyrians came in, and the Assyrians are the first ones in antiquity that we're aware of that exchanged populations when they conquered an area. So if they conquered Pat's territory, they made sure to get all the influencers, the most important people that made the society function, and they forcibly moved them to a totally foreign land. So they're going to move Pat's total influencers and all the people that made society work, and they're going to move them way over to where Nanette is. And then they're going to take Nanette's population and swap it to where Pat's is. Now, what you've done is you've taken a group of influencers and moved them all the way, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away, to a geography that people are not aware of, a language they're not aware of, culture they're not, and they've done population and cultural language shifts. This makes it very easy to govern because, and this is the same thing, by the way, they did with slaves in the United States. They tried to be sure that they mixed up the slaves from different areas. So you got slaves from one part of what we now call Nigeria, a part we got from northern Ghana, a part we got from Sierra Leone. You got them and mixed them up because it was understood that the languages were different and that the cultures were different. So therefore, it'd be very, very easy to manipulate and control them. Big word, control. Just let me parenthetically say that one of the things that the slave owners didn't realize, that the slaves were not subhuman. They were incredibly intelligent, quickly evolved a new language that they could all speak, and quickly evolved how they could deceive the slave owners. And a classic example of this would be Santeria, where they realized that the slave owners had these religious artifacts that we now call Roman Catholic saints, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they realized if they could use these as fronts, they could use these as hideaways for their own orishas and all of what they had from the homeland. So the subhumans, which were obviously not realized to survive, they needed their own language that the slave owners couldn't understand or speak. They would brought their gods and goddesses using our language with them, and they used the Catholic iconography and all of the things to mask their continuing religion. It was absolutely brilliant. Oh my God, another cat. We're surrounded by cats. Look at that thing. The cat is having a ball. So I share that with you. What happened in the north is they brought in a bunch of people basically from the Mosul area, and we're gathering from today archaeology and stuff that the people that were in what we now call the northern part of Israel and southern Lebanon were moved to Mosul. They swapped them back and forth. What happened was a matter of survival. You got two different sets of people that learned a new language and learned to intermarry and learned to make a new society. Rather than dumping on these people, which will later happen from Jerusalem, these people should be applauded for surviving. They came up with a new language, and their hybrid religion, you all will know later on, will be called Samaritans. Yeah, the Samaritans that get dumped on and everything else, except from Jesus, in fact, were the remnants of that surviving groups that had to do with absolute horror of being moved around, switched around, loved ones sent across over there, new people dumped in your backyard, and they survived. The heirs of this group will become known as the Samaritans. And of course, they are still, there's still a group of Samaritans left today, by the way. There are still some pockets of Samaritans left in Israel today. Okay, moving along. Also, now this is something else most people are not aware of. Did you ever look at the stories of David and notice how unflattering a lot of them are? I don't know about what you learned about David, but when I was in Bible school, which is a millennia ago, growing up, David was made this pure saint. Nothing ever did wrong, and everything that was in the Bible got actually buried very quickly. And so you got this image of this great songwriter, this wonderful person, united the tribes. Wasn't he great? When you actually study 1st and 2nd Samuel, the picture you get is somebody who was a mercenary, somebody who worked for the Philistines, would work for Saul, worked for whoever paid him. You got somebody who, when he got in power, made some great moves, but made some great bad moves, including premeditated murder. And that's just not going to go away. And some of the other things he did. Now, you might want to ask, where did those stories come from that paint David in such a bad light and tell you all the stuff that you're not supposed? Where did they come from? That's the question you ought to ask. Not that he behaved that way, which is interesting, but where did they, who remembered these? And this gets to be interesting. Let me go back a little bit in history. I pointed out we had David, then we had Solomon, and Solomon's son, and I mentioned this last class, had to go before the tribes and get elected. He didn't want to do that. He was told by his friends who grew up in the palace and wealthy areas, you are it. You don't need these peasants' approval. Well, he did. He insulted them. And they basically, the 10 big tribal chiefs said, well, the polite version is, we're out of here. He was furious, sent his taskmaster to arrest him, and they stoned his taskmaster. He fled on a mule to Jerusalem, and took his kids with him, his teenage friends with him. And you now had the big kingdom of Israel, 10 tribes with most of the land and most of the money, and the 2 little tribes and the city of Jerusalem. That was it. People remembered David. They remembered his story, which was not lily white. They remembered all the warts, and there were lots of them. They wrote them down for posterity. When the Assyrians moved in, there were refugees who moved down, holding their nose to Judea, hoping they could find some sanctuary. There were enough of them that brought money and influence that the small group that still had Jerusalem had to welcome them. And to accommodate them, yes, you're absolutely right. It would be helpful if they didn't whitewash, but thanks to modern archaeology and genetics, we're able to unwash the white. So they moved down, and they brought the stories of David with them, and they would not go away. So that's where the stories came from those people of the original 10 tribes in the country of Israel. The refugees were able to move down and escape Assyrian deportation. They arrive and they say, these stay. They stay, and they brought with them a story that nobody wanted to hear, but it wouldn't go away. Now, to show you how the story about David and Bathsheba really, really didn't get out, when I was teaching Old Testament class, Hebrew Bible, somebody offered to read the story of David and Bathsheba. They'd never read it before. It was a young, very devout evangelical. I said, are you sure you want to read this? And I said to the rest of the class, did any of you really know the story of David and Bathsheba? Nobody knew what I was talking about. I said, this comes from a telenovela. In fact, telenovelas came from this. So this kid gets up, he's 18 and starts reading about what David did, how he orders Bathsheba over and what happens. And then he reads about how her husband, Uriah, is set up for murder. And he stops, he says, how did this get in here? What is this? This is not the David I know. I said, welcome to the real world. There's lots of stuff you don't know, and it's not pleasant. in the class said to me, this is premeditated murder, in case any of you forgot the way this worked. Bathsheba was married. She was married to Uriah the Hittite, who is listed, by the way, in Jewish scriptures as one of the 30 great warriors of Israel, Uriah the Hittite. He is out on a campaign. So David calls him back, hoping that when he goes back, he'll sleep with Bathsheba, so the baby will look like it's Uriah's. Yeah, it's all there, by the way. It's all, you can read it. It's right there in nice black and white in the books of Samuel. So what does Uriah do? He does not go in to see Bathsheba. He sleeps with the peasants. David hears this, throws a fit and says, why were you sleeping with the peasants? Why didn't you go home? He said, the rules are when the army is in the field, if I get called back, I don't get to enjoy nice benefits. I have to act as if I'm with the army. Those are the rules. David is beside himself. So he has him come over the next night and gets him drunk, thinking, aha, fruit of the vine will do it. He passes out again with the peasants. At this point, and this is all written down, Samuel, he sends Uriah with a letter to Joab, the commander. Uriah doesn't know what's in the letter. The letter says, listen to this, send the men up to battle near the gates, near the wall. I know this is dangerous, but give a signal so the men will know to come back very quickly. Do not tell Uriah the signal. Yes, he will die. Don't concern yourself about this. You heard that. Premeditated murder. You're going to send people near the wall where it's dangerous, a prearranged signal. The men fall back. Uriah is left by himself, and he's dead within seconds. That is about as premeditated as you can get, and nobody said a word. Scared to death of David. So they're meeting in the palace, and guess who speaks up? There is this old crusty prophet named Nathan. And Nathan tells the very, very famous story. He says, I want to tell you all a story. And David, who think he's hid all of this, he said there was this poor man and his little kids, and they had a little ewe lamb. And a stranger who had many flocks and herds came and visited and demanded the little ewe lamb, and took the little ewe lamb, and they slaughtered and ate it. This little ewe lamb, he said, used to stay with the family and was patted and part of the family. And David was enraged and said, that man deserves to die. And Nathan says very quietly, you are that man. Now, obviously, somebody remembered all of this and wrote it down and was not up for whitewashes. So when you really study David and all of this, this is the kind of stuff that gets thrown into the mix. And some of the stuff that Solomon did gets thrown into the mix. When Solomon becomes king, there's a bloodbath, typical Mideastern bloodbath. Lots of people die. And then when Solomon dies, as Hindu said, your actions have reactions, then his son loses it all. So you need to know where all of this stuff comes from. Now we go to 596 with little Judah. I mentioned that last time. They made a bad pact with the Egyptians who didn't show up. The Babylonians did. And 5,000 or 6,000 people get deported. 10 years later, the same thing. The Egyptians didn't show. Another 5,000 or 10,000 get deported to Babylon. That leaves, again, who is left behind? And who is left behind are a bunch of peasants who try to do the best they can to survive with an area that is overrun with non-Hebrew people, non-Canaanites, overrun. They're poor and they're getting by as best as they can. And I cannot not speak enough for this group that nobody ever seems to care about. What we always seem to focus on is those exiles who, by the way, are living quite well in Babylon. They're given their own area to live. They're given their own food. They're given their own place. The king is not executed. The original king is not executed. I mean, they're treated quite well as exiles go. And there are probably 10 or 15,000 of them by the time they recreate, procreate, reproduce, and everything else. But nobody pays attention to the people who are left behind, who are having to do what? get by as best as you can. And they will also, and this becomes a major point later on, they're also going to intermarry. Who are they going to intermarry with? People that are there. Now, this becomes a big issue. And I always like how people sit at an armchair 1,000 years later and say, well, that's big. You shouldn't intermarry. And I'm thinking, okay, you're sitting in some armchair 1,000 years later. What would you do if the average life expectancy is about 20? Most of the kids die in childbirth, as do the wives. You've got very little to live on. What are you going to do? They don't have the luxury of sitting in some armchair 1,000 years later looking at this stuff. You're not on the ground. So this becomes people survive and you do the best you can. Look at Miami. The intermarriage rate in Miami is very high. And by the way, when I say intermarriage, every so often I'll get Anglos who say to me, I use that phrase very lightly, Anglos say to me, well, Hispanics intermarrying is no big. I said, you don't know anything about Hispanic cultures. Somebody from Chile marrying somebody from Puerto Rico is are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? What don't get me? That's just Hispanic doesn't simply means, and I said to my students, my definition of Hispanics is those poor cultures that had a bunch of 18, 19, 20, and 25-year-old brats who descended upon a culture bringing disease, rape, and pillaging, and tried to force people into a culture, language, and religion that was not theirs. And so you get people in Chile, people in Peru, people in Ecuador. And I said, none of these cultures are the same. Maria grew up in Colombia. Colombia has different cultures as well. There's a culture on the Pacific coast that's all African American. It's black, very, very different Colombian. There is a culture in Cartagena that's heavily native. Yes, indigenous. The Amazon, a good chunk of the Amazon is in Colombia. Most people are not aware of it. There are multiple tribes there. Colombia alone has multiple cultures. And so you look at all these cultures, when people say they intermarry, Hispanics intermarrying is as wild as somebody from Scotland marrying somebody from England. Those are very different cultures. And by the way, take a look at the Caribbean. Somebody from Trinidad, well, Trinidad has two very, very different cultures, one Indian and one African American. Intermarriage is an issue. So, I mean, you got to do what you got to do. When I came to Miami, I represent a multiple bunch of cultures, and I never expected to ever marry again. I did not consider myself the marrying type. In fact, marriage to me my marriage to someone else or vice versa was not a good thing. My track record was, to put it politely, challenged. And I meet a woman from Colombia. What the hell is that? And we've been together 23 years. What is that? It's still going strong. So I said, intermarriage, you do what you got to do. And if somebody came back now and said to me, you married outside our group, I thought I'd probably punch him in the nose. I mean, how you weren't here. You weren't living my life. You weren't trying to survive. Don't tell me who I should and should marry. So I get really angry when I read people thousands of years later saying you shouldn't do that. You're not there. You don't know what it's like to live there. So here's the deal. The people in exile now begin to collect their stories. It is very, very clear there are two main groups there, amongst others. One is that group that is compiling and has kept rituals and very strong ideas about who does the rituals. That'll get known as the priestly group. Groups that do rituals, groups that say there are certain ways that things need to be done, and there's certain ways that, what is the underlying presumption that mixing cultures is a bad thing? Because the underlying presumption is your own culture is pure, and you're mixing the purity. I'm just telling you what gets argued. I think it's idiocy myself, personally. When you do your DNA, you see how stupid that is. Who's pure? I mean, look at our DNAs, everybody. Carol Reiter Carol Reiter is said, you know, when you get a birth certificate, you ought to get an automatic DNA certificate attached to it, and you can't rip it apart. I thought that was brilliant. The latest DNA, and it's stuck to your birth certificate, so you can't separate them. Roy had a very interesting chat there. I always lose these things. Hold on a minute. What's with the underlying presumption that mixing is a bad thing? Why wouldn't it be seen as a bad? Well, I would agree with you, Roy, 100%. But there is always in every group. Now that's arrogant. My observation has been, it seems that in every group, ethnically and religiously, there seems to always be a group that claims their ethnic group is the best, or their religion is the best. And to keep it the best, you have to do certain things. And then you get other people who assume, let's go find other people and see what they have to say and do. What else is out there? What can we learn? So people ask me, you know, why do you continue to teach? Because my classes are made up of electives of students who want to go out and learn. I have 100 and some students right now in 3 classes, divided up in 3 classes, all of whom are there because they wanted to learn about other people and other things and other religions. It's an elective. Oh, by the way, as a footnote, I got evaluated last week. The chairman of the department arrived and said, guess what? I'm here to evaluate you. No pre anything. So you need to know the way I handled this. So I said to everybody, okay, guess what? We have a surprise visitor. The chair of the department is here. And she puts down, don't tell everybody that. So I said to everybody, I'm not supposed to tell you that. Then she said, knock it off. And I said, I'm supposed to knock it off and behave. The class thought this was a riot. Anyway, afterward, I got the evaluation. And you need to know that I asked my students, and I'm very serious about this, every semester I said, there will become a point where I am not able to teach well. And you'll know when, and I need you to tell me. I need you to make it very clear that I've lost the ability to communicate, or I become cranky, or I'm not teaching you in a way that is effective. You need to tell me that. I don't need to be destroying other classes and other people's precious time because I'm no longer good at this. Then I get all kinds of comments like, you're out of your mind. Don't even think of leaving. But I got the evaluation, and it was nice to see the things that she said. It is amazing. She said, these classes are elective. They're packed. Even though it's Zoom, they respond. And she said, the energy level, this is a Zoom class. The energy level is palpable. She said, you can feel the energy though everybody's there. So it was a nice evaluation. And it's kind of like what we do here, the same kinds of thing here. Now the chatter's saying, you know, what you're getting is cliques. You're going to get within every ethnic group, a group that thinks theirs is it, or every religion, theirs is the only right. And you get that, for instance, in Judaism, Orthodox thinks it's it. Christianity, where do I begin? Where do I get in Christianity that X group thinks it is the only Christian group? It's the only true expression of Christianity. I mean, where do you begin? You look at the divisions between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. And I'm thinking, you know, it seems to be an issue of Homo sapiens. And this is where I go back to looking at primatology 101. If you start looking at the behavior of troops of chimps, we are simply emulating where certain troops assume they're more powerful, more aggressive than they are, and therefore they lord it over other groups. Within a troop of chimps, you're getting a small group that will bully everybody else and lord it over everybody else. They will consider they are the ones who are the strongest and the most powerful and know what to do. So this behavior is not the religion's fault, my own opinion. It's not the ethnic group's fault. It's part of who we are and what makes up our DNA. That's just opinion. I seriously don't think we take our 99% chimpanzee seriously enough. That's why I keep saying we need to take a course in primatology before we start talking about psychology. By the way, this goes on warfare. To digress a moment, I'm well aware of the fact, and I hate to be grim about this, All you need is one errant missile shot off by mistake and hitting London, and we're into World War III. All you need is a misfire from someplace in Belarus or on the border of Ukraine, and a missile hits London, we're in World War III. Or hits Paris. Or much to the German shock, it hits Bonn or Berlin. And I was looking about warfare amongst chimps. Yeah, I dug that up. And it's in our species DNA to engage in warfare and aggression regularly. And I don't know if any of you have ever looked, I mentioned this a couple of months ago. Have you ever looked at the number of people who died in the 20th century from warfare? It's over 100 million. We now have warfare amongst chumps. Yeah, the problem is the chumps are going to, I worry about this, but it's in our DNA. When you look at the way chimps patrol territories, they will kill other male chimps that don't belong in it, or they'll grab territory, and it's unceasing. Yes, absolutely. Religion should be the counterpoint to that. And I would like to hope this gets to be an interesting thing. One of the questions gets is that one of the major differences between chimpanzees and Homo sapiens is this. While we've inherited all the warfare and the aggression, one thing that we do seem to have is the attempt and hope for peace and the attempt and hope for good things. And that is a major, major difference. And that's not something you find in chimpanzees to the same extent you do with Homo sapiens. It's almost like the Zoroastrians were right. Really, we're dealing with dualisms. We've got good and evil. We understand the evil. The question is, where does the good come from? Now, I'm not suggesting a higher power as a being, but I'm suggesting a real question is, it's very evil. It's very understandable to see where the warfare and the aggression comes from. But the question is, where's the good? That's an interesting question. From where does the good come from, given our species? All right, moving along then. We've got then these two groups. Let's go back to the exiles. One is a group that will collect rituals, who does them, and how they're supposed to be done. And by the way, I never cease to be amazed, even within Christianity and Judaism, how incredibly aggravated people get if they think a ritual is done incorrectly. I'm serious about that. I remember, this is embarrassing, I've mentioned this before, but it's so incredibly interesting. My first year in seminary, one night we had too many beers, and a lot of people were there and on the floor, and they got into this incredible argument. Now listen to this, this is embarrassing. In this incredible argument about how, listen to this, how do you hold your hands when you're celebrating communion? And I look back about this, and people got in heated discussions. And I remember, as inebriated as I was, I said in my head, I hope there's not a God that's watching this, because this is a very embarrassing. I said, I would hope God has far better things to do than to worry about how people hold their hands over a bread and cup. People got really mad. I mean, really, they got, I've been really angry. I mean, you would be amazed at the number of ways there are within Christianity, the way you're supposed to hold your hands when you celebrate communion, the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper. You'd be shocked. And there are even ways of doing blessings. Do any of you know that that if you go to Eastern Europe, the way you make the sign of the cross is very, very different than the way you go to Western Europe. And for those of us who were never used to making the sign of the cross, John's father-in-law was the one who came up in Port Orange when they asked me to go bless the houses. And he said, you're making the sign of the cross wrong. And I said to his father-in-law, I've never made the sign of the cross. Well, he said, good, it's about time you learned and do it right. And so I didn't know that. And it turns out when I made blessings, I did the Jewish blessing. Didn't know that that was supposedly wrong either. The Jewish blessing is you hold your hands like this. you don't make any signs of the cross. So I was doing a Jewish blessing during a Christian service of bread and cup and didn't know that that was supposedly wrong. I still do that. And I didn't know that there was a difference between, by the way, for those of you who didn't know, you'll notice that the sign of the cross is usually in the name of the Father, Son, and you go to the left by the heart. That's the Catholic way. No, 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 no. The way is you go this way, this way. You go to the right, the name of the Father, Son, and to the right. Now, God forbid you're dyslexic. God forbid you're dyslexic or have spatial issues or don't get things right because you're going to be a mess. And there'll be somebody who said it isn't done right. Now, I've got to be nice about this. I really, 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 really do. Yes, the right is Eastern Orthodox, any kind of Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, you're right, any kind. It gets to be, yes, and I'm saying there are people who take this really, in every religion, there are certain ways that must be done. And I don't know where this came from, really. I don't care what the religion is. There are certain ways that must be done, certain dress that must be worn certain ways. And by the way, there are certain ways you're supposed to put on vestments. I never mastered that. But there's something goes on here and something goes on here. It doesn't make the difference what the religion is. In Judaism, when you see a prayer shawl, Nanette, you can help me with this, or Danny can. In Judaism, about the bottoms of the things, the way they are the bottom of the tassels, the way they're knotted, has a whole different meaning. Am I right?
Yeah, look, I'm not Orthodox. I know that the Orthodox do wear those fringed garments, and it's supposed to trace back to some commandment in the books of Moses, the Torah. But yes, like some very ritualistic Christian faiths, these details matter enormously to these people. Yes.
Yes, and then what about at the bottom of the prayer shawl? The way these things are knotted is a very important thing. What is that?
I wouldn't know. My family were all rebellious Reform Jews. They never wore those.
The reason I know this is because when I was in class, I used to swap pulpits with a Reform rabbi when I was in Port Orange, and for the anniversary of the temple, there wasn't somebody to come in, so they asked if I would come in, and they gave me a prayer shawl as a gift because they said, you're really an honorary member here. So I brought this to class, and one of my Orthodox Jewish students says, you have to be careful how you wear that. And I said, why? The bottom of the prayer shawl has these, let me get one. Where is it? Where did it go?
The whole thing is called a tallis, is it?
A talit.
Talit.
They're at tzitzit. They're called tzitzit.
Okay, you know what they are. Okay, Roy, thank you. And the way you knot these is very, very important in Orthodoxy. They're hanging down, and the way you knot them. And the Orthodox student said to me, whatever you do, you cannot wear that in an Orthodox shul if you ever go. And he said, if you're allowed in one, and he said, you can't do this, you can't do that. And I said, the Reform doesn't care. He said, well, they don't know, they don't get it. So you're going to find in every religion, there is a group that is priestly. There is a group about how rituals have to be done, must be done, and the way in which you do them. And obviously for people like us, that would be problematic. Okay, that would be problematic. All right, so this group, you're going to find the readings of this group very easy to discern in the Hebrew Bible. Moses is in the desert with a bunch of peasants, and suddenly you have him doing these priestly rituals. And you're thinking to yourself as you're reading this in the book of Exodus, wait a minute, how could they do these priestly rituals? Where are they going to get these vestments? It's talking about these vestments in the book of Exodus. I'm thinking, okay, you are a bunch of peasants who have escaped with the rags on your body. You're all illiterate, most of you. You're peasants. Where are you going to know? Where are you going to get these things? Who's going to make them? How are you going to make them? Out of what are you going to make them? And you'll see these elaborate rituals. You're going, where did that possibly come from? What you're getting now, you see how this begins to form. You're getting a priestly group that insists any story must include the rituals, and what are they thinking of? The rituals from the temple in Jerusalem. And this existed long after Moses was born and died, if he was a real person. The story of Moses, we are positing roughly, or somebody like him, about 1200 BCE. The first temple wasn't built till the 900s. And it was built by a pagan, and it looks like a pagan temple on the outside. So anything that went on there, that these priestly types are thinking about are what they're remembering from the 500s. And you better believe the way the temple services were in the 600 and 500s were not the same they were when the temple was first opened under Solomon. And by the way, I need to show you something about the temple. And I don't know if any of you ever saw this. Let me see if I can do this very, very, very quickly. Let me show you. This was in our textbook. Can you see this? Can you all see this now?
Mm-hmm.
The top is Solomon's temple, is Solomon's house. The bottom is the temple. Look at this. When people talk about the great temple, when you actually look at the layout of Jerusalem, that is Solomon's palace at the top, and the temple was tiny compared to it. So when I was in Sunday school, I thought this temple was this huge, enormous thing like St. John the Divine in New York City or whatever else. And then they showed you what the actual numbers and the cubits were and all the rest of that. It was kind of embarrassing. So you need to know when the priests are conducting all this stuff, they have remembered the rituals and liturgies from the early 600s, the late 500s, and that's what they wanted. They were assuming that, of course, this was the way it was done during the time of Moses. Well, you can see why the scholars are saying that simply couldn't do it. Broad question, is there a happy medium between obsessing? Yes, of course there is. And I think you're going to find an example with that would be, for instance, Reformed Judaism would be a happy medium, where there are rituals, but they're not obsessed about it. I think you would see this at broad church Episcopalians. Anglo-Catholic Episcopalians are nuts about that. Low church, or almost like Baptist, broad church, it would be called, an old phrase. I don't mean to embarrass anybody, but All Souls would be an example of a happy medium. A lot of Unitarian services are very bare. They are basically taken, and I was talking about this to some colleagues. They said, Kenneth, unfortunately, you're right. They are basically a very, very bare bones service of readings and music and a sermon. We have a lot more than that. And we are not, we're jokingly called high church in Unitarians, but we're not at all. We have an ordered service with lots of reading and lots of participation. In a congregation like ours, you're asked to read, you're asked to respond, you're asked to do all of that. In most Unitarian congregations, you sit and listen. You sit and listen to the music, you sit and listen to the readings, you sit and listen to the preacher. And if you look at the Episcopalian morning prayer, book of morning prayer service, remove the chants, and you basically have a Puritan service, because the Puritans tried to purify the Church of England. What did they use when they broke away? Morning prayer. And you'll notice in a lot of Unitarian services, what happens? You have an opening, call to worship, prayers, readings, prayers, sermon. No, then you have the offering, hymn, sermon, hymn. The offering's tacked on at the end, which is what Episcopalians do with morning prayer. You have the service, offering, hymn, sermon, hymn. Our service is the service, the sermon comes in the middle because it's only one part of the service. Our service is designed so there are lots of parts of the service, not just a personality preaching. And you'll notice we end on a common meal. The common meal is symbolic that we're all in this together. It's a symbolic meal. So we would be a middle of the road kind of example where you have some, but not lots. Okay, now the other group we have, a lot of Caribbean people are Anglican, yes. And they divide up into different groups too, low, middle, and high. We've got Jamaicans in All Souls, by the way. We've got some Jamaicans in All Souls too. Okay, what's the other group? The other group is a group that wants to keep alive the story. Now, you're going to love this. The story is that all the screw ups happened because people really aggravated and ticked off God. Yes, Roy. Okay, Roy and Maureen can figure that out. I can't follow the chat.
I'm sorry, we were talking about something else, but yeah.
All right. The other group has the following opinion. The North was all wrong. It was their fault that everything went south. They got what they deserved. Seriously. Secondly, if we'd stayed in Jerusalem and done what God wanted, none of this would have happened. In short, the exile is punishment because we didn't pay attention to the rules. We didn't pay attention to the way things are supposed to be. We didn't pay attention to the preaching, and therefore God got mad, and this is why we're here. So when we go back, we're going to center it in the temple. We're going to center it in Jerusalem, and we're going to listen to the damn laws and the damn preaching the way it's supposed to be so it doesn't happen again. Does that make it clear, everybody? And that's basically their point of view. That will become known as Deuteronomy, D. The idea that you can find a basic teachings, and it's centered around some scrolls that were found by accident in a storage room when they were cleaning out the temple. The scrolls at the time, now you're going to enjoy this to no end, were put away because they didn't mean anything. They were brought down from the north, and they were stuck away because they came from the north and they didn't mean anything. It's interesting. They meant nothing then, but 100 years later when you're in exile, voila, look what we have here. This is it, folks, and this is the way it must be. So this group of D and P will write competing stories about the way it should be. One, it should be centered in the temple, and there's certain rituals to be done. The other group, no, you must listen to the teachings and the laws. And ultimately, the two stories will be put together, along with some other commentary. These other commentaries are things that cannot be removed because they're there and everybody knows they're there. And at that point, we have to stop because I have a wedding in a couple of hours. But next time I meet with you, I'm going to read to you some passages of scripture that nobody wants you to read because it totally refutes in their commentary this whole idea that Moses marched with this enormous group of people out into going into the land of milk and honey. He dies, and Joshua takes this mighty army in a three-pronged attack, wipes out Canaan because it is promised to them, the chosen people, and that's the way it happened. I'm going to show you in Joshua and Judges that somebody kept census forms and shows you it didn't happen that way at all. And it's right there. Here you go. I'll explain it to you. And so when you read in Karen Armstrong's book, the archaeologists, when digging, to find proof of these stories that D and P want you to believe is it. There's nothing on the ground, nothing that backs it up, nothing. And wait till we come to the tribe of Dan. From the beginning, people had ideas about this tribe. It's way out there on its own. Geographically, that should tell you everything you need to know. It's up in the northwest quadrant, right edged in Philistia. Yes, right there between the Phoenicians and the Philistines. It culturally looks like it is totally unrelated to anybody else. And guess what? We now know it is. And why? Archaeology. By the way, before I go, you've got to take a look at this. The very things we're talking about are what are the background of this book, Origin, a Genetic History of America. All the stuff you and I were taught, folks, is wrong. It's like the universe. Remember, there is a universe? Remember the idea 13,000 years ago, these dudes made it across some landmass called the Bering? Remember that? Ha! That's out the window too. What this book says, that for the first time, and the Israelis did this long before this, and it's only been verified now, What you're now combining is archaeology, genetics, DNA, and anthropology. And when you combine the three, the story is very, very different than what you and I have been told. By the way, I don't know if you saw this, there have been human footprints found in White Sands, New Mexico, 22,000 years old. Well, was that ghosts? I mean, we were told 13,000 years ago. And what about the cave art in Colombia that's 20,000 years old? Did you see that? There was this valley that was inaccessible. And some people just were going to explore it, and they found a mile of cave art, ochre, beautiful paint. And they DNA'd it to, I mean, they carbon 14 to 20,000. You should see the artwork. Unbelievable. And this was not Neanderthals. So I'm just saying who did, it turns out, some fabulous artwork too now we have found by accident. So welcome to the real world, folks. Genetics / DNA, archaeology, and anthropology are giving us a total wake-up call to whole bunches of new things. And well, the problem is, it turns out, Ron, there were areas where there was no ice, like along the coast. The big thing now is, everybody joked at this. I have to watch the time. You and I are told they came between ice sheets. This group goes across the Bering Land Stretch, and between ice sheets, miraculously filtered down. Somebody else said, that's a stretch. Did you ever take a look at the ground? That probably didn't happen. It was solid ice. It was glaciers. Look along the coast, folks. It was too warm to have ice. Now they're finding all kinds of stuff along the coast, and voila. Go back to the one universe theory. By the way, just a question. Did any of you ever ask, if there was one big bang, why there couldn't have been more? Did any of you ever ask that? I remember thinking myself as a teenager, wait a minute. What if these things go in cycles? What if it was like a big bang, and then a big bang, and a big bang? And,
Sounds like Hinduism to me.
yeah, I mean, it's like all this stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like Hinduism.
So I'm just saying, I'm looking at this, and I find this fascinating. If we don't blow the planet up, it'd be nice to find out what's out there. Let me just say one other thing that that one of my students said, and I thought was fascinating. He said, isn't it cool that we're learning all these things about these religions? And he said, you know, we can take a lot of this stuff with us. And I said, it's important to remember that there are some people for whom that doesn't work. There are some people, and this is neither good nor bad, it's just an observation. Yes, that's a good point. Yes, but there can be, but that's all changing too. It's now called multiverse. The universe is now switched to multiverse, and multiverse, cosmic inflation, pocket universes, and quantum tunnels. Ooh. Now, don't ask me what those mean. I'm just sharing with you the latest stuff that's out there. So when we look at how the Israelis and others are looking at the ground, they're saying we're combining all, and the story doesn't match with what we're coming up with. The story just doesn't match. Now, that raises some other questions, and then we'll finally begin to get into the book. But it raises some other questions. And that's what makes it fascinating. Anyway, my student said to me, this is cool how we can bring stuff with us. And I said, but it's important to remember, this doesn't work for everybody. I said, if you took this class, you took the class because you were something in you was fascinated learning about what others think. You didn't have to take this class. It's elective. I said, but not everybody likes to do that. There are lots of people who want a box, and they're very, very, very happy with a box. Okay, I'm missing some chats. I mean, this looked like 42. Oh, the answer to the universe. Ah, yes, answer to the universe, 42. That was a great read in the book. That was a great, great read.
Yeah,
So,
the answer is 42. Now we need to figure out what the question was.
yeah, yes. So,
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
yes, the great 10,000 generations. And I remember the computer saying, but you're not going to like this.
You're not gonna like
You're
it.
not going to like this. So, the kid said to me, this is great. We can learn things. He said, but remember, folks, not everybody is like us. You and I are like sponges. The more stuff that comes up, the more fascinated we are. We just like, whoa, tell me more. Teach me more. But a lot of people find that very frightening. And they consider that just not the way it is. They consider it an affront to the way they look at the universe. And they think this is like an affront to their God. And we just have to be aware of that. And I say that not unkindly. I'm just saying that people have to get by with how they get by. And there are a lot of people for whom being open and single is just it just does not work for them. It just does not work for them. I suspect most of us are genetically, in some way or form, are not satisfied as this is the way it is, period. I would guess most of us are not satisfied with that approach to life. And so when we see all of this, we're neither surprised, we are pleasantly surprised and want to know more. And the name of that new telescope that's coming out, that new, the new thing in the sky, is the Williams, what is the name of the?
Webb.
James Webb?
James Webb.
James Webb. Wait till we get the stuff from that. Oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow. It's going to make Darwin look tame. All right, everybody, I've got to run. Next week, we'll continue with more of the story. And then I've got a bunch of questions to ask you, including while some of this may be creative, hopeful fiction, do occasionally things sneak in that are true? And that becomes a very interesting quest itself. And that's why people like me stick with it. Because you're finding diamonds amongst the coal, the real coal, as opposed to diamonds in the coal. All right, we see you soon. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.
All right.
Thanks, bye.